My Civ 7 explainer videos, done, boom, out of the way. Now it's time to focus on my honest impressions after playing Civ 7. I've heard yours from, wow, this is amazing, to, go, bad game. So now it's time for me to take my explainer gloves well and truly off and move on to my impressions, my experience. Again, thanks to the kind folks at 2K and Firaxis who flew me out to check out Civilization 7 early. I'm going to begin though with the map and art style. It's the first thing that you notice, obviously, when you load up the game before the Civ selection drama is how it looks. And I don't know if I agree with popular opinion or not, but honestly, I really do like it. This game looks good. It's a bit cartoony, like Civilization 6, but it also has a bit more grit and realism. The developers talked about being inspired by the kinds of dioramas that you might see in a museum. They're rich and they're detailed, they're like a little mini version of what they're trying to replicate on Earth. And generally, I feel that this is a move in the right direction. It suits my general taste, honestly, kind of Humankind-y. The leaders, I note, have been compared to things like The Sims and many other games in the comments section, and I can kind of see where you're coming from. I kind of agree. Ultimately, I don't have an issue with the way that they look. I think that they suit the look of the game pretty well, and overall, I do agree with a lot of you in the comments section, at least the more vocal ones, talking about how it looks a bit like Humankind. I mean, Humankind didn't have navigable rivers, but I can see it in the sense that it's vibrant, it's quite attractive to look at. Again, this is going to be subjective. I know a lot of people disagree with me on that one, but I do stand by it. I like the look of this game. It's a fairly attractive, somewhat realistic, colorful board to look at. I like the look and feel. Let's talk about the other thing that really impacts the feel of a Civ game in particular, and that's the changing of civilizations. They have this graphic, you've probably seen it already on my channel and others, as well as the reveal, but it basically takes you through how there are 3 decisions that you'll make. Your first civilization, and then 2 opportunities as you move through into the exploration and then modern ages to change your civilization once more, twice more. So overall, you could play as 3 different civs. If we freeze frame, of course, the first decision is basically just game setup. So really we should look toward not the antiquity age, but instead to the first actual decision point, the exploration age. The example they give is Egypt becomes Songhai, seemingly no way to stay as Egypt. I'm still a little bit unclear about that, by the way. From my playing experience, I couldn't gather. From their presentations, it's a bit vague as to whether you can just stay as Egypt the whole time or not. The other options are either unlocked by in-game choices or they are leader-based. However, when we look at the modern age, those restrictions are taken away, either to simplify this image because they're not quite ready to talk about the modern age yet, or because it's completely open. It remains a little bit unclear. But if you're playing as Songhai, you unlock Buganda. So there's a changing of civs. However, the wording here is particularly interesting, and in the gameplay breakdown, they show very briefly in this tiny little clip that I've slowed down some very interesting things. Firstly, it's referred to actually in a very Humankind-esque, perhaps a more realistic sounding culture emerging, not a new civilization emerging. You can see the options down here. Play as Egypt, choose Songhai. There's also Aksum and Amina available. And finally, I'd point out that the age unlocks are also very blurry. Apologies for the quality, it's the best I can do, are also displayed on the right-hand side of the screen. The point that I'd like to drive home is, firstly, leaders remain the same. Just to avoid any confusion, I've talked about this already in my explainer videos, so I don't need to go into detail, but the leaders will always be consistent. We'll also touch on consistency as a whole in a later chapter, Timecards of course down below. But the point that I wanted to drive home is that they refer to it as a culture. They're not going to, obviously, because it's literally in the name of the game, civilization. But I sort of thought about it a bit more as a cultural evolution rather than a complete change of a civ. Does it bring up questions around consistency, around building a consistent story, and being able to build one around your enemies and so on? Yes, it does. I'll address those slightly later. I'd like to shift the conversation a bit more towards that adjacent feature. Talked about this in yesterday's video to explain how it worked. Let me tell you how it feels and my honest impressions of it, the ages system. pretty clearly fundamental to how you change civilizations, right? It's with the change of an age that this happens. Toward the end of an age, a crisis event will take place. It'll be fairly significant. It'll change something on the map. You'll have negative crisis cards. We'll look at those in a moment. But really, this is about changing your civilization. It's about building more onto what you already have, but also, crucially, and they didn't talk about this too much, losing what you already have as well. The developers talked in their presentation to me and others about how they were inspired by London in particular, going from Roman to then Norman, 1066, and finally that sort of industrialized, the Industrial Revolution, into the modern and postmodern eras of London, sort of 1700s, 1800s onwards. And how that changing can influence and should influence the design behind ages in Civilization 7. In practice, I don't think this will be as bad as what I imagine is a fairly large minority and quite a vocal minority of players feel it may be. This is not the extent of Humankind, and it didn't feel that kind of gamified, rushing through the ages quick. I need to get as many stars as I can to move through as quickly as I can to secure my choice. And then as soon as you get through, you're immediately rushing through into the next one. It wasn't that intense. The age felt long enough that I wasn't constantly fixated on the changing age. What do I need to do? How do I need to get there? Are those stage gates and goals still there? Yes, they absolutely are. A Civilization 7 takes more of what I would call kind of a quest-based approach. I think they refer to it in the game as legacy pathways, but there are also challenges that can come up through events based on who you pick and play that can steer the direction of an age. I think that having 3 is actually a pretty good number. Does it perfectly and accurately reflect history? No, but this is ultimately a game. It should still be fun, and the age mechanic shouldn't be everything. And my limited experience is actually the balance is pretty good here. Speaking of my gameplay experience and balance overall, I'd like to drill a little deeper, not talking about a specific feature of the game, though we will return to combat later, but more broadly about how I played. So I sit down, it's about 9 a.m. They've provided some sort of breakfast kind of buffet stuff and some coffee. I elect for no food, just take a black coffee. I sit down and I have probably about 3.5, maybe actually more accurately about 3 hours worth of hands-on experience, because I think the studio tour beforehand and the presentation from the developers beforehand actually took up a bit more time than I give it credit for. And then right at the end of my play session, I had a one-on-one interview for probably no more than 15 minutes with a couple of the guys from Firaxis, the team behind the game. But most of my visit was that gameplay portion. I played as this dude, actually, Augustus, as my leader for production in the capital for every town, and more benefits toward towns through my civilization choice, where I chose to go with the boring old historical choice of Rome, right? So I was leader Augustus playing as Rome. I'm also going to answer a few of your questions here. One of them was, did it make sense to choose the pairing? Was I penalized for choosing anything else? The answer is no, you're not really penalized for it, but it does make sense to choose the historical one. The game will push you toward picking that, and the synergies are easier, right? It's easier to understand. They're very highly synergetic. You can't go wrong with picking the historical choice. The other thing that came up a lot in the early game and in your questions in the comments on my last video was religion. What is religion in the game? Is there a victory for it? How does it work? I can't answer this fully because nobody was able to play through into the modern age, the final age. But the Pantheon founding worked almost exactly the same as Civ 6. A whole load of the benefits seems to just be copy-pasta jobs, just the exact same thing. Here it is again. Very intuitive, a big long list though, so you spend a bit of time reading it, right? Otherwise, mechanically exactly the same. One thing that I would note though, is that there weren't any religious units that I saw. Now maybe I just didn't get far enough into the game. I feel like they probably pop up in the middle of the exploration, maybe toward the end of the exploration age. So maybe they are there, I just didn't see them, but my feeling is that religion and faith spreads a little bit more based on cities and a little bit less based on micromanaging units. Will they still be there? Again, I guess probably, but the feel is a bit more kind of Humankind-esque, a bit more Millennia-esque, in the sense that it sort of comes from the cities and the towns, vibrates out from them, if you will, spreading based on some sort of numerical value that you can influence. I like that as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end of the video. Religion as a whole doesn't appear to have a victory condition. If it does, and the way that it's laced into the game is more around culture, I would say the culture legacy pathways, influence as well is a big deal here too. That other new mechanic that I personally focused in on a lot. It's not entirely new, right? We've seen civilization dabble with mechanizing or tokenizing diplomacy before. We've also seen influence directly in other games. I'm thinking Humankind, Millennia. So the mechanic itself is not brand new. Civ 7 seems to do a very good job though at bringing it into the game, at tokenizing it, as I've mentioned, very quickly, and giving you a lot of use cases for it. It's diplomatic actions, basically every single one of them, from supporting war support in a foreign war to building up or tearing down a relationship with another empire on the map, or maybe one of the independent peoples, who, by the way, I also leaned into a lot in my playthrough, both attacking them militarily and also befriending them, and this is where the real influence kicker came in. Because you use influence for interacting with them, once they become your friend, you can levy units from them, just as you could in previous Civ games. This case, it's inspired, directly derived from your influence generation, I should say. Because of that, I could spend about 30, bearing in mind that I had about 600 to 900 in the bank at any given point, to levy a unit. The cost might have went up to about 75, and of course these numbers are going to be highly subject to change. Long story short, I was able to, I don't know if I'd quite go to the level of the spiffing Brit, is Civilization a perfectly balanced game? I broke the game, because it wasn't quite that bad. But I was able to levy around 10 military units out of them over the course of perhaps 20 turns in game. They were units that were on par with me. It was sort of archers when I had archers, that kind of thing. And you could just steamroll over anybody next door to you very easily. Speaking of which, actually, another question that came up a lot, I would say, fairly regularly at least, was AI. What was the AI like? Now, I played on standard difficulty, and I was able to beat the game fairly easily. Is that normal for Civ? Yes. Am I the best player? You bet your backside I'm not. So I wouldn't dare try and challenge it on deity or the maximum difficulty. Long story short, I couldn't really tell you. Honestly, it just wasn't enough. The AI did seemingly do a pretty good job at managing its military units early on. It put them in the right place, it was scouting out very well, it was sort of on my borders, protecting its borders. It seemed to do a good job, but again, just too early to say. I couldn't give you a concrete answer to that one. The final thing that came up was around, well, there were lots of things that came up. So if I missed something, yet again, here's a shameful call to action. Let me know in the comments below, and we can come back to it in a future video or maybe a live stream. I don't know, I'll see how I'm feeling. It was around the military, around the new military units. How did they work? Was it particularly fun to play? Was it different? Combat in of itself is not that different. You still march the units across, click yours on theirs. Things like high ground, terrain, the type of unit, the rock, paper, scissors of combat are all still very active. But now to focus in on combat just a little bit more and shift away from that more Q&A section, let me tell you a bit more about the commanders and a theory that I have. So the commander unit, which you saw here in the gameplay, has a special unit ability. It also has a special unit promotion tree. That's what you're seeing with this. Commander points picked up basically by the commander being in and around combat. Generally, you can assign them to give it extra bonus points when flanking, extra yield generation from pillaging, just extra strength, or focus in around its mobility. One of the key functions, perhaps the key function of a commander, is this ability, to gather adjacent land units. You can also, by the way, send newly trained units from cities to a commander. The commander can be really far away. I'm talking like 20, 25 tiles mine were, and it seems to just take one turn. So you can train a unit in a city or town, send it straight to a commander, it only takes a turn. It will then be stacked into the commander in the same way that adjacent military units can be picked up and then, bam, deployed, just like these Egyptian ones were deployed right now on your screen. This is very strong. And the first time that we've really seen this in Civilization. I know that we had the ability to combine like-for-like units to make them a sort of a much stronger, armada or whatever it may have been in Civ 6. But this really takes it to the next level because you can carry around 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 units with a commander, depending on their promotions. Move them around very easily, right? So less micromanagement, less clicking 1,000 times a turn, and then also deploy them, perhaps in a strategic or surprise fashion, if you're that way inclined. What it does overall is reduce micromanagement. It also makes for more interesting strategic gameplay, I think. I think this is a big win. My other theory around this, and we didn't have this confirmed, but there are, I believe they confirmed this part, 3 types of commander. I would note and theorize there are 3 ages in the game. The first type of commander we had access to was the land-based one, the army commander. It therefore makes logical sense that in the age of exploration, one about seafaring activity, there might be a naval commander. And finally, in the modern age, you guessed it, bucko, we've got flight, so surely there's an airborne commander. And I think that that's probably how that'll play out to reduce micro and maybe increase strategic gameplay across the board. I would note that if the stack gets hit, they all take damage, so they're very precious. Speaking of very precious, these little towns are very precious. And I have some opinions on these. Basically what they've done is taken that kind of millennia style, build a city, and then near it you can build smaller settlements, towns. Towns feed their yield, their generation, into the cities that they are attached to, and they seemingly attach almost immediately. Again, the micro is removed, there's not a road builder unit. At worst, it'll be done through trade and trade routes, but I believe it just happens basically straight away. So, you have these towns. What do? Feed their yield. In my experience, it was just gold. I believe there are other ways that you could change this, perhaps, maybe over time, different leaders, I don't know. I had a very town-focused build, playing as Rome and Augustus, and levying a shitload of units using my influence from my nearby city-state, whatever they're calling them, friend. I was able to sweep across and pick up a whole load of cities, which actually led to me basically just picking up a whole load of towns and having them attached to cities. You can convert a town into a city. I didn't do it though. I didn't really feel the need with my build, and also it was somewhat expensive, at maybe something like 900 influence. Not gold, mind you. Could I spend that? Yes. Did I want to? No. The towns are all good. They also, of course, grab nearby yield, nearby resource generation in particular. Speaking of resource generation, it's handled a little bit differently in Civilization 7. There's a bit more depth this time. I didn't play with it a boatload, and they haven't talked about it a shitload either. But my recollection is that there are 2 different types of yield, perhaps resource. One of them is empire-wide, and the other is local to a city or town. The empire-wide benefits feeding into perhaps things like happiness, money generation, and then localized benefits available too. You can deploy them into a city, or take them out of a city and deploy them into a different one. So towns could potentially pick something up, and then you could deploy that more localized resource somewhere else. Then obviously there's the actual districts themselves, which again I think are a little bit of a silent winner. There's not a lot of controversy around them. They're not a big step change either from Civilization 6. A few nice quality of life features, division between urban and rural. I think they've linked it better to population growth. The sort of reintroduction or maybe fleshing out of specialists is another great win. Basically what I'm saying here is it's largely the same as Civ 6, a bit more natural in the way that it grows out from a city, and I would argue a little bit better in the way that it handles growth at the sort of more extreme, the higher ends. You can build many different buildings within districts, and as you move through ages, some of those buildings will become redundant, and you'll need to replace them with new ones. The application of specialists or more focused population, more population within a district, I believe should also strike a better balance between tall and wide. I think Civ 5 did tall better than wide. I think Civ 6 personally did wide better than tall. I hope that Civ 7 can strike a balance with this new district placement and a real focus on putting maybe specialists and more buildings within them. But I'm honestly not quite sure yet. You've got a whole load of leader combinations, a whole load of civ combinations. There's going to be a bit of difficult adjustment, I think, leading into this. And then also some complications around how you balance it all. Don't get me wrong, I don't expect the game to be perfectly balanced, even just on the cities and towns fronts, but I do think that there'll be a lot of routes for chaos here. This is just my crystal ball gazing prediction. I don't know if it'll be true. I have some others that, again, my limited experience might not be enough to talk about it, but I think we should talk about overall consistency and accuracy issues, because this comes up again and again and again. Particularly, obviously, around the changing of civs. You're changing multiple times. Is this going to feel disjointed from a gameplay perspective? Will I lose track of who's who too easily? Will it be consistent enough that I can build a story in my head, right, around that guy over there, or whatever? I don't know about you, but when I'm playing, and when I struck those inconsistencies, particularly, I'm thinking recently about Humankind, I found that it was often because I lost track of who was who, and this came down to two things: the face value and the color. Firstly, the color. A lot of the time I'm looking at the map, not the leader. I'm looking at the color of the civilization, their town, their borders, the way that their area is tinted, maybe the symbol and the name around it as well. And then secondly, for me, I'm looking at the leader, or maybe assigning a name to them, to put it more broadly. The question is, for me, not does civilization build an accurate telling of history? Because, let's be real, I don't know if any one of us have ever played a game of civilization that has been historically accurate. I believe what I at least, when I talk about accuracy, am actually looking for is a sense of authenticity. Because I am ultimately playing a 4X historical strategy game. And I don't just want to see like a whole load of blue men in charge of Doopla Boop City flying around in spaceships from day one, right? I want a historically accurate experience. But I'd also be kidding myself if I thought that it would actually be perfectly accurate. I mean, we'd be changing leaders every turn or every 2 turns. It would be a political mess, right? Like, let's not go completely down the accuracy hole. However, it does need to be authentic, and I do want to be able to build a consistent story and a consistent narrative. And so the big question mark over my head, and that question mark didn't go away from the time that I spent with the game, let me be very clear to you, it's still there, is can Civilization 7 build that consistent and authentic experience by messing with the formula of just choose your civ, choose your leader, and buckle in for a wild ride of nuclear weapons. And all the other nonsense that comes with a civ game. I can't answer that for you yet. I'm sorry. I just can't. However, I believe it's got a pretty good shot. I remain optimistic that it will pull it off. But I don't think it'll happen straight away, and I'll talk about that in the launch section very soon. Though I think it's also worth addressing the strategic depth, the micromanagement elements here. Was it easy? Was it hard? Did it feel good to play? All of that is encompassed inside of this. I'm personally a fan of ditching some of the micro, and it might be controversial to say, but I don't mind seeing the back of the builders and workers of old in favor of just using the city screen to manage the tiles and improvements. That's all good with me, honestly, and stuff like that can go. And I think on balance, from what I've played, they've done a pretty good job, at least in appealing to my interests, in removing much of that micro. I mean, the worker is a great example, but it's not alone. I suspect there would have been plenty of opportunity to have similar units, particularly even in the later early game, like envoys or micro trade units, but a lot of that is either removed or stripped back. I think also on the flip side to this, not to sort of shoot that first argument in the foot a little bit, but while they've stripped a lot of this micro away, there's also a new layer of management that we perhaps haven't seen before, or not quite in this shape and form. I think back to things like the leader promotions, the attributes, that we haven't really seen any gameplay of, but are kind of these skill trees or ability trees, I suppose, that branch away as you build up experience. More of them become revealed, available to unlock. You can upgrade your leader as you progress. The same for the commanders, right? They have their own promotion trees, so you can really invest in them and their experience and their speciality. And so while some of the micro has been taken away, some new depth has been added where it didn't previously exist. And so, ultimately, it's probably more of a new Civ experience than kind of a reshaping or repackaging of Civ 6. I think it's one area where we will see a lot of change, but ultimately it will be that kind of background change that affects things like pacing or decision making, but that maybe isn't quite front of mind. I think the stuff that is really crucially front of mind is stuff with Canvas, like the changing of civs, right? The more controversial stuff. So let's talk about that inside of my launch concerns, the penultimate section. I think that it will inevitably be a little bit of a controversial one, a little bit problematic within a somewhat large, but still minority of the audience. They'll be fairly vocal. I've experienced this myself, by the way. I'm not trying to sling mud here. Like when Civ 6 came out, I thought this art style really not for me, alongside many other things. Some of them I adjusted to, others I just got used to, and some more I began to appreciate. And I think that that will happen here as well, right? I don't need a great crystal ball to predict that though. Somewhat divisive within the player base, many will choose to keep playing older civs, just like there are still an extraordinary number of people actually who play Civilization 5 regularly today. I think that the release window 6 months from now seems reasonable. The version of the game that I played was probably on a really high-end computer. It looked great in 4K. Will it be the same on lower-end systems? I don't know, but obviously there's going to be a trade-off there, one that I can't speak to. The other element about launch that has me scratching my head a little bit is that for the first time in the franchise's history, it'll be launching on all platforms, all major ones, but including things that are fairly old, like the Nintendo Switch and the previous generation of PlayStation and Xbox hardware. And it's all happening at the same time. I'm not a development expert, so I really, shouldn't speak too much out of turn here, but it does interest me that the game is releasing on all platforms and at the same time. Obviously a stripped down version. I think you'll see that in multiplayer capacity for the consoles. We'll have to wait and see. I'm optimistic though, and that probably brings me around to my overall experience in review. My experience with Civ 7, my impressions, so here it comes. Overall, I'm optimistic. The changing of civilizations like this ages thing you're looking at here doesn't really bother me that much. I liked it in Humankind. Was it flawed in Humankind? You bet your backside it was. Did it mess with consistency and storytelling throughout? Yes, it did. There are some important lessons to be learned, but I don't believe that the concept itself is fundamentally flawed. And I think that by really only coming across it twice, and hopefully having options that are vaguely historically authentic, but not necessarily accurate, because again, reaching perfect accuracy has never happened. I believe we're looking for authenticity though, and that part is still a question mark over my head. How will everybody respond to it? I think it'll be a little mixed, but on balance, I actually remain optimistic. I need to get my hands on the later game though, to really feel how those transitions play out. Whether the pacing remains consistent, and whether the game can stay just as interesting as it is in the first age. Because the first age is pretty good. But overall, I do generally like the look and feel. Changing civs is okay, but I think that criticizing those changes misses that realistic point. It's never truly realistic, and a fixed leader over 4,000 years makes no sense. However, it should provide that level of consistency that I want to see, because ultimately it is a game and it is about the player experience. Keep the colors or the symbols, the leader consistent, and it should be enough to hold that classic experience while also flirting with something new. I remain optimistic, but I'd love to hear your thoughts below. I'm sure they are varied and wild, and I've probably said some things that you just don't disagree with, and I'm probably going to be wrong on some of this stuff too. It is ultimately still early days. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.